In the frozen wastelands of the Eastern Front, where the German Wehrmacht clashed with the Soviet Red Army in the most brutal theater of the Second World War, a weapon emerged that defied everything military engineers thought they knew about explosives. Soviet soldiers, huddled behind meters of reinforced concrete and steel, believed themselves safe from conventional artillery. They were catastrophically wrong. The Germans had developed something that seemed to violate the laws of physics itself, a shell so devastatingly effective that even hardened veterans whispered about it in hushed tones, calling it witchcraft, black magic, the devil's own ammunition. This is the story of the shaped charge, the hollow charge projectile that revolutionized modern warfare and turned impenetrable fortifications into death traps. Before we dive into this incredible tale of engineering genius and battlefield horror, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories of the Second World War to life. Now, let's journey back to one of the darkest periods in human history. The year was 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun with unprecedented ferocity. Millions of men, thousands of tanks, and entire armies swept across the Soviet border in the largest military operation in human history. The Germans, confident in their blitzkrieg tactics, expected a swift victory. But the Soviets had prepared something the Wehrmacht hadn't fully anticipated, an extensive network of fortified positions, bunkers, and defensive lines that stretched across vast territories. These weren't ordinary fortifications. Soviet military doctrine emphasized defense in depth. Bunkers were constructed with reinforced concrete walls, sometimes exceeding 2 meters in thickness. Steel plates reinforced critical sections. These positions were designed to withstand direct hits from heavy artillery. Machine gun nests, anti-tank positions, and command bunkers dotted the landscape, each one a miniature fortress capable of holding up advancing forces for hours or even days. Traditional high-explosive shells, the mainstay of artillery since the First World War, worked through blast effect and fragmentation. When they struck a bunker, they would certainly cause damage, crater the exterior, perhaps cave in weaker sections. But against properly constructed Soviet fortifications, conventional shells often proved inadequate. You could fire dozens of rounds at a single bunker and achieve nothing more than cosmetic damage. The defenders inside remained combat effective, their weapons still able to pour devastating fire onto advancing infantry. The Germans needed something different, something revolutionary, and they found it in a principle that had been discovered decades earlier, but never properly weaponized: the shaped charge effect, also known as the Monroe effect, after the American scientist Charles Monroe, who had studied it in the 1880s, or the Neumann effect after the German scientist who independently researched it. Here's where things get fascinating, and why soldiers genuinely believed they were witnessing something supernatural. A shaped charge doesn't work like a normal explosive. Traditional explosives push outward in all directions, creating blast and fragmentation. A shaped charge, however, focuses the explosive energy into a single, incredibly powerful jet of superheated metal and explosive gases. This jet, traveling at speeds exceeding 7 kilometers per second, can penetrate armor and concrete with an efficiency that seems impossible. The secret lies in geometry. German engineers discovered that by hollowing out the front of an explosive charge and lining this cavity with metal, usually copper, the detonation would collapse this liner inward and then project it forward as a hypervelocity penetrator. The temperatures involved exceed those found on the surface of the sun. The pressures are measured in millions of pounds per square inch. When this jet hits concrete or steel, it doesn't just explode against it. It burns through, melts through, creates a narrow but devastatingly deep hole that allows the remaining explosive force to channel directly into the interior of the target. For Soviet soldiers, the experience was nightmarish. Imagine sitting in your bunker surrounded by 2 meters of reinforced concrete, feeling completely secure. Artillery has been hitting your position all day, and while it's terrifying, the walls have held. Then, suddenly, without warning, a different kind of impact. Not the usual thunderous explosion that shakes the structure, but something else. Something that sounds almost like a cutting torch on an industrial scale. Then comes the flash, the heat. The overpressure wave channeling through a hole no wider than a fist, but extending completely through walls that were supposed to be impenetrable. Men near the impact point don't have time to scream. Those further away are killed by overpressure, by the blast wave bouncing around inside the enclosed space, by the fragments of the interior concrete wall turned into deadly projectiles, by the fire and toxic gases that fill the bunker in seconds. The primary German weapon that utilized this technology against fortifications was the steel granite 41, a stick grenade design that could be fired from specialized launchers, or in some configurations, delivered by infantry in close assault. But the principle was also incorporated into artillery shells, anti-tank rounds, and specialized demolition charges. The versatility of shaped charge technology meant that everything from handheld weapons to heavy artillery could suddenly threaten fortifications that would have been impervious to conventional attack. Soviet intelligence initially struggled to understand what they were facing. Reports from the front described impossible penetrations, bunkers compromised by shells that shouldn't have had the power to breach them. Some reports spoke of German secret weapons, of new high explosives with magical properties, of shells that somehow melted through concrete. The word witchcraft appeared in more than one intelligence summary, not as a literal belief in magic, but as an expression of complete bafflement at what was being witnessed. The shaped charge shell typically consisted of several key components. The outer casing provided aerodynamic stability and protected the internal mechanisms. Inside was the main explosive charge, usually a military-grade compound like TNT or a more modern composition. The crucial element was the shaped cavity at the front, lined with copper or another appropriate metal. Behind this came the fuse mechanism, carefully designed to ensure the explosive detonated at precisely the right moment and from precisely the right point to create the maximum jet effect. Finally, the base of the shell contained the driving band that engaged with the rifling of the gun barrel and, in the case of artillery shells, the cavity for the propellant gases. When fired, the shell would travel to its target, following a ballistic trajectory. Upon impact, the fuse would initiate the main explosive charge. The detonation wave would sweep through the explosive, collapsing the metal liner inward at tremendous velocity. This liner would then be projected forward as a jet, with the tip traveling at hypersonic speeds and the tail following at somewhat slower but still supersonic velocities. This jet would strike the target and begin penetrating, creating temperatures high enough to vaporize steel and concrete, pressures high enough to flow solid materials like liquids. The effect on Soviet defensive strategy was profound. Fortifications that had taken months to construct could be compromised in minutes once German forces brought up the appropriate weapons. Static defense became far more dangerous. Bunkers needed to be deeper, better camouflaged, more dispersed. The concentration of forces in fixed positions, a cornerstone of Soviet defensive doctrine, became a liability when a single well-placed shaped charge shell could eliminate an entire position. But here's something crucial to understand. The Soviets weren't passive victims of this technology. Soviet intelligence and military engineers worked frantically to understand the new weapons and develop countermeasures. One of the first discoveries was that shaped charges had an optimal standoff distance. The jet needed a certain amount of space to form properly after the initial detonation. If it detonated too close to the target, the penetration was actually reduced. This led to the development of spaced armor and standoff plates, additional barriers placed at a distance from the main bunker wall that would trigger the shaped charge prematurely, reducing its effectiveness against the primary structure. The Soviets also worked on their own shaped charge weapons. While they had been slower than the Germans to develop this technology initially, by the middle of the war, Soviet forces were fielding their own hollow charge anti-tank rounds, anti-tank grenades, and demolition charges. The asymmetry in shaped charge technology that had given the Germans such an advantage in the early years of the Eastern Front began to narrow. Let me share a specific engagement that illustrates the devastating effectiveness of these weapons. During the German advance toward Sevastopol in the Crimea in 1942, Soviet forces had prepared extensive fortifications, including numerous heavy concrete bunkers housing artillery positions, command centers, and ammunition stores. German forces, including specialized engineer units and heavy artillery, brought up shells equipped with shaped charge warheads specifically to reduce these fortifications. One particular bunker, designated by the Soviets as Strong Point 12, was considered virtually impregnable. It housed a battery of medium artillery pieces and had walls constructed from 3 meters of reinforced concrete with additional steel plating. This position had withstood several days of conventional artillery bombardment with minimal damage. The Soviet commander inside reported to his superiors that the position was secure and would continue to provide fire support for the defensive line. German intelligence had identified Strong Point 12 as a priority target. Rather than continue with ineffective conventional bombardment, they brought forward specialized guns loaded with shaped charge shells. The first round struck near the primary firing aperture. The penetration was total. The shaped charge jet burned through the reinforced concrete in a fraction of a second, and the explosive force channeled into the bunker's interior. The entire gun crew was rendered combat ineffective immediately. Secondary explosions from stored ammunition followed. Within minutes, a position that had been expected to hold for weeks was completely silenced. This pattern repeated across the battlefield. One by one, Soviet strong points that should have held for days or weeks fell in hours, once German forces deployed their shaped charge weapons effectively. The psychological impact was immense. Soviet defenders couldn't trust their fortifications. The sense of security that concrete and steel provided evaporated when soldiers knew that a single shell could penetrate anything. Now, it's important to note that shaped charge weapons weren't a magical solution to all defensive problems. They had limitations. The shells were more expensive to manufacture than conventional ammunition. They required more precise quality control and production. The fuses needed to be carefully designed and maintained. Against dispersed targets or troops in open terrain, they offered no advantage over conventional high-explosive or fragmentation rounds. They were specialist weapons, devastatingly effective against their intended targets, but not universal solutions. The manufacturing process for shaped charge shells was complex and required significant expertise. German factories producing these munitions needed skilled workers, high-quality materials, and precise manufacturing tolerances. The copper liners in particular needed to be formed with great accuracy. Any imperfections in the cone shape could dramatically reduce the effectiveness of the jet. This meant that production was limited compared to conventional shells, and quality could vary depending on which factory produced them and under what conditions. As the war progressed and Germany's industrial capacity came under increasing strain from Allied bombing and resource shortages, the quality and availability of shaped charge munitions became more inconsistent. Factories were destroyed, rebuilt, dispersed. Skilled workers were conscripted into the military or lost to bombing. Copper became scarce as supply lines were disrupted. These factors meant that by the later stages of the war, while the Germans still possessed the knowledge and desire to produce these devastating weapons, their ability to do so in sufficient quantities was compromised. The Soviets, meanwhile, were rapidly advancing their own capabilities. Soviet industry, relocated beyond the Ural Mountains and out of range of German bombers, was producing increasing quantities of war material, Soviet-shaped charge weapons, while perhaps not as refined as the early German versions, were being manufactured in growing numbers. Soviet anti-tank grenades using hollow charge principles became standard issue. Soviet artillery began receiving shaped charge shells for use against fortifications. By 1943 and 44, as the tide of the war turned and Soviet forces began their great offensives westward, they were using shaped charge technology extensively. German fortifications, prepared positions, and defensive lines now faced the same devastating weapons that had proven so effective against Soviet bunkers in the early years of the war. The technological advantage had been neutralized, and Soviet superiority in numbers and industrial capacity began to dominate. One aspect that deserves mention is the theoretical work that made shaped charges possible. The physics involved are genuinely complex. Understanding how explosive detonation waves interact with metal liners, how these liners collapse and form jets, how these jets penetrate targets, all of this required advanced knowledge of hydrodynamics, material science, and explosive chemistry. Scientists in Germany, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union all contributed to understanding and refining the technology. It was a genuinely international scientific effort, even if the practical applications were being used by enemies to destroy each other. The man most closely associated with the weaponization of shaped charge technology in Germany was Franz Rudolf Tomanek, an engineer who worked extensively on hollow charge weapons. His research and development work helped transform an interesting scientific curiosity into a practical battlefield weapon. But he was part of a larger team of scientists and engineers, many of whose names have been lost to history, who collectively solved the immense practical problems of turning theory into reliable, mass-producible munitions. If you're finding this deep dive into Second World War technology fascinating, don't forget to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. What other aspects of the war's technological innovations would you like us to explore? Your engagement helps shape the content we create, so please take a moment to interact with the video. The evolution of shaped charge technology during the Second World War set the stage for modern anti-tank and anti-fortification weapons. Today's military forces routinely use shaped charge warheads in missiles, rockets, rifle grenades, and artillery shells. The same basic principle discovered in the 19th century and weaponized in the Second World War remains the foundation of modern armor penetration technology. Reactive armor, composite armor, and other modern defensive measures are all responses to the persistent threat of shaped charge attack. For the soldiers who experienced shaped charge weapons firsthand on the Eastern Front, whether German or Soviet, the technology represented a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare. The castle walls had fallen, metaphorically speaking. No amount of concrete or steel could guarantee safety. This drove tactical changes. Dispersed formations, mobile defense, rapid maneuver, all became more important than static fortification. The human cost of these technological developments was immense. Every innovation in weapons technology during the Second World War translated directly into human suffering. For every German engineer celebrating a successful penetration test, there were Soviet soldiers whose bodies would be destroyed by that weapon. For every Soviet engineer who managed to develop a countermeasure or their own shaped charge weapon, there would be German soldiers who would experience its effects. The mathematics of destruction are clean and precise, but the reality is blood, terror, and loss on an incomprehensible scale. Survivors of bunker attacks involving shaped charge penetrations described the experience, for those few who lived through it, as utterly surreal. The bunker would be struck. There would be a sound unlike anything else. Part explosion, part something that sounded almost like tearing metal, then light and heat and pressure. Some described a sensation of the air itself becoming solid, crushing them. Others spoke of their ears bleeding immediately, their vision going dark, the sense that the world had suddenly become hostile in a way that transcended normal combat. For those outside who witnessed a bunker being struck and penetrated, the sight was equally disturbing. Sometimes flames would shoot out of firing ports, sometimes there would simply be silence afterward, a position that had been active and dangerous suddenly going completely quiet. The logistics of deploying shaped charge weapons in combat were also significant. These weren't fire-and-forget weapons in most cases. Artillery crews needed to be trained in their proper use. Forward observers needed to identify appropriate targets. Ammunition handlers needed to understand that these shells required more careful handling than conventional munitions. The increased complexity meant that shaped charge shells were typically reserved for priority targets, fortifications that absolutely needed to be reduced, armor that needed to be defeated, situations where conventional ammunition had proven inadequate. German tactical doctrine evolved to incorporate shaped charge weapons as a standard part of the assault plan when facing fortified positions. Reconnaissance would identify bunkers and strong points. Artillery observers would direct fire, often beginning with conventional shells to range in and suppress the position, then switching to shaped charge munitions once accuracy was assured. Engineer units would carry man-portable shaped charges for close assault if necessary. This combined arms approach, integrating specialized anti-fortification munitions with traditional assault tactics, proved highly effective when properly executed. Soviet defensive doctrine also evolved in response. Bunkers were designed with multiple chambers so that penetration of one section wouldn't compromise the entire position. Blast doors and barriers were installed to contain overpressure. Escape routes and emergency exits became standard, recognizing that even the strongest position might be penetrated. Dummy positions were constructed to draw fire away from real fortifications. Camouflage and concealment became even more critical. The bunker that wasn't detected couldn't be targeted. The shaped charge shell represented in many ways the triumph of human ingenuity applied to destructive ends. The same scientific principles, the same engineering expertise that could have built hospitals and schools, that could have advanced peaceful technology, instead went into creating weapons of unprecedented effectiveness. This is one of the great tragedies of the Second World War. So much genius, so much talent, so much potential, all bent toward the purpose of ending human life more efficiently. As we reflect on this technology and its impact, it's worth considering the broader context. The Eastern Front was characterized by brutality on a scale that defies comprehension. Millions lost their lives, military and civilian. Cities were reduced to rubble. Entire populations were displaced, starved, or eliminated. The shaped charge shell, devastating as it was just one weapon among thousands, one technology among many, all serving the larger machinery of industrial warfare. The soldiers who faced these weapons, who died when their bunkers were penetrated, were individuals with families, with hopes, with lives that were cut short by decisions made far from the battlefield. The word witchcraft that gives this story its title reflects something important about how soldiers perceive technological change in warfare. When something new appears on the battlefield, something that breaks the established rules of what's possible, it can seem supernatural. Machine guns in the First World War, tanks breaking through trench lines, aircraft dropping bombs from above, each innovation initially seemed almost magical to those who faced it. The shaped charge shell was particularly dramatic because the violation of expectations was so complete. A shell that could burn through meters of concrete didn't just challenge tactical assumptions, it challenged the fundamental understanding of how explosives worked. German propaganda, always eager to promote technological superiority, certainly emphasized the effectiveness of their new weapons. Radio broadcasts and newspapers would report on impregnable Soviet positions being reduced by German firepower. The implication was always that German engineering genius was superior, that German weapons were more advanced, that victory was inevitable because of this technological edge. Of course, this propaganda ignored the larger strategic picture, ignored Soviet industrial capacity, ignored the fact that technological advantages are temporary and can be copied or countered. Soviet propaganda responded by emphasizing the heroism of defenders who held their positions despite the weapons deployed against them, by highlighting Soviet technological achievements in other areas, and eventually by showcasing Soviet versions of similar weapons. The narrative shifted from defending against German secret weapons to using Soviet science to defeat the enemy with his own methods. The actual reality, as always in war, was more complex than any propaganda narrative. Shaped charge weapons were effective, but not decisive. They were one tool among many. Battles were won or lost based on strategy, logistics, numbers, training, morale, and countless other factors. A single technology, no matter how impressive, couldn't determine the outcome of a conflict as vast as the war on the Eastern Front. As the war moved into its final years and Allied forces closed in on Germany from both east and west, shaped charge technology had become relatively commonplace. American and British forces used their own versions against German fortifications. The Siegfried Line, the Atlantic Wall, German defensive positions throughout Western Europe faced assault by weapons incorporating shaped charge principles. The technology that had seemed like witchcraft in 1941 was standard munitions by 1944. The post-war period saw continued development of shaped charge technology. Modern anti-tank missiles like the TOW, the Hellfire, the Javelin, all use sophisticated shaped charge warheads. The principle has been refined, improved, made more reliable, and more powerful. Today's shaped charges can penetrate armor that would have been inconceivable during the Second World War. But the fundamental concept, the idea of focusing explosive energy into a penetrating jet, remains unchanged from what those German engineers developed in the early 1940s. For historians and military analysts, the shaped charge represents a case study in technological innovation during wartime. The pressure of combat, the desperate need for solutions to tactical problems, the resources available for research and development, all came together to rapidly advance a technology that had languished in obscurity for decades. War, for all its horror, does drive innovation, though one must always question whether the human cost of that innovation is justified by the technical achievements. As we conclude this examination of one of the Second World War's most significant weapons innovations, it's worth remembering the individuals involved. The German engineers who developed these weapons, working under pressure to give their nation's forces an edge. The Soviet soldiers who faced them, defending their homeland against invasion. The Soviet engineers who worked to understand and counter and replicate the technology. The countless men on both sides who lived and died in the brutal combat on the Eastern Front. Each one had a name, a family, a story that extended beyond their role in this immense conflict. The shell that shredded Soviet bunkers like butter, that seemed like witchcraft to those who first encountered it, was ultimately a product of human intelligence applied to human destruction. It represents both the incredible capability of scientific advancement and the terrible ways that capability can be directed. As we look back across more than 8 decades, we can study the technology, understand the tactics, analyze the impact, but we must never lose sight of the human cost behind every statistic, every technological achievement, every battle. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of the Second World War's most fascinating and terrifying weapons. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss future episodes. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What aspects of Second World War technology and tactics interest you most? Until next time, remember the past, honor those who lived through it, and work for a future where such conflicts become truly a thing of history.